Today we're going to be talking about fantasy world building. So with fantasy world building, or any type of world building really, it's important to start with your setting. Yes, it's important to have well fleshed out characters. If you don't have well fleshed out characters but you have a fleshed out world, it's going to fall flat. You need both. If your world is not properly fleshed out, then the characters feel like they are acting in a white room or a white space, which can be less than beneficial. It makes it so that there's a lot less you can do with your characters. Whereas if you have a solid world and your characters aren't well built, that's also a problem. So you're going to have well solidly built out characters and well solidly built out world. Today we're going to just be talking about world building and how that is going to benefit your characters if your characters are properly built. Alright, so the first thing we're going to talk about is setting of your novel. Is it primarily set outside? Is there multiple settings? Is it primarily set inside a mansion? Is it primarily set inside some sort of crazy contraption of a maze? Your setting is going to dictate how your characters interact with things. For example, if your character is primarily outdoors all the time, but they have hay fever, that is going to drastically change your story than if they are outside all the time and they worship nature. That is going to look entirely different. So your setting ultimately is going to give light to how your character interacts with things. What they like, what they dislike, what they, it's going to show what they do and show how they feel about things. So with this setting in your novel, if you're making up a universe out of whole cloth, I recommend creating your own little map. It doesn't have to be big or fancy. I actually talked about this with the Teen Writers Club. If you want to look at my fantasy world building stuff for maps, I would highly recommend making a simple map. It doesn't have to be crazy, just has to be a map. Don't spend 2 hours on your map, just make a map, because that will help you know where things are set, and if you get confused, you can always refer back to said map. That's going to help make sure that you feel at ease in your universe instead of going, wait, where was that thing again? And that's going to make you feel a lot more stressed and a lot more unsure of yourself. That being said, with the setting of your novel, if you have any sort of like cultural things, you might want to make note of that as well. But overall, you're going to want to make sure you have your environment set first. For example, if you're living in a snowy environment versus a very tropical environment, that's going to change how people live, how people dress, their culture, etc. That being said, next you want to flesh it out with things. You want to add the furniture and the foliage of your novel, so to speak. So if you're doing the setting in a mansion, then having a whole bunch of furniture around can definitely change how it feels though, right? When a home is just empty, you don't really feel much of it. However, if you add cozy furniture that's all fluffy and comfy, then you're going to feel a very cozy vibe in that mansion, right? Whereas if you fill it with these very harsh stucco, black and white, modernist furniture, you might feel a little bit more like, oh, I don't feel quite as homey here. I don't feel quite as comfortable. I feel a little rigid, a little set. That's going to flesh your home out to feel different. It's the same thing with fleshing out the furniture and the foliage of your novel. If you're an outdoorsy person and your nature is tropical, you might talk about the humidity and how hot it is, whereas if it's snowy, you might talk about how cold it is and how you fall through the snow and how you're worried about cracking ice. It's going to change the texture of your novel, and it's going to change how you feel about it. For example, with scary stories, if you have a haunted mansion versus a cozy mansion, that is going to give very different vibes. If you tried to set a haunted scene in a very cozy, very warm, very pleasant mansion, it almost might feel like a comedy. Whereas if the mansion is rigid and hard and kind of dusty and old, it slowly starts feeling more and more like it's got a creepy vibe. And that creepy vibe is going to help add to the characters and how we feel about them in the story. It also is going to help show us how the characters interact not only with that setting but with those objects. So for example, with me, I'm currently sitting in a chair talking to you guys, and I have my computer slightly tilted so that way you can see me better because I'm short. These are all small details that show how I interact with the universe. The tilting because I'm short and I don't want to have to deal with it looking like this because the computer's taller than I am, and so putting it on the desk, I gotta fix it. Those are just little things, but they help create a texture and a flavor for your novel. For example, if someone's fiddling with a knife while they're talking to someone in a very bitter tone, you're like, ooh, I'm not sure if she's gonna stab so-and-so at any second. That is definitely something that gives you a different texture and a flavor to that novel. Whereas if she's bouncing up and down and giggling as she says something very creepy, you're like, okay, psycho, not sure about you. Whereas if she's bouncing up and down and giggling, it makes you feel very much, and she's talking about something very happy, then that makes us feel differently. It's the same thing with the furniture of the home and how they interact with it. Like I said before, if they're touching a knife and they're very angry, you're probably thinking they're going to stab the person. Whereas if they're touching a knife and they're doing so very delicately to cut a piece of meat, you're thinking, oh, very classy, gourmet little dinner here. It's very fancy. Or if they're interacting with, say, there's a big comfy couch and yet they lie down on the couch and there's nothing to do. You can tell they might be a little bit spoiled. They might be a little bit of a brat, right? Or you could have the same interaction and have it be a terribly uncomfortable couch and they're lying on the couch and they're sinking into it like it's the most comfortable thing on the universe, and yet it's the most uncomfortable couch ever. And you know that they're exhausted. They must truly be exhausted to think that that couch is comfortable. That's going to entirely change how you feel about the characters and the setting and how things work together. That being said, this is why it's important to flesh out your novel properly. If we don't have the furniture and that foliage that we can interact with, then again, it just feels like a white space. And white space is, as you can tell by the white wall behind me, very bland, very uninteresting, not very cool. You're just kind of going, it's white, I guess. It's not like you're interested. Now, if there was a giant mural painted behind me, you'd be like, oh, is that a random octopus in that mural? And you'd be much more fascinated. You'd be like, that's cool. That's very cool. I'm paying attention. And with the fleshing things out and interacting with things in your world, that's going to help both flesh out the world and flesh out the characters. If you have a whole bunch of dogs and the character's like, oh man, those dang dogs. Maybe they had a bad experience with dogs. Or if they're like, oh my gosh, these are the cutest things on the planet. They really love dogs. Or maybe they're just more of a cat person and they're like, oh, the dog is cute, but I really would love a cat. Again, these are all interactions that you can have. If you didn't have the dog, though, if we just had basic world, white room kind of syndrome, you didn't describe the world at all, how am I supposed to interact with that dog to give you a feeling of how I feel about it? It's the same thing with characters. The more texture and reality you have to the world around you, and the more texture, reality you can give to your characters, you can show that. This is why people have such a hard time with showing versus telling. Usually, the reason why authors tell is because either A, they're worried that you're going to miss a detail that's crucially important, and so they feel the need to info dump or else you'll miss it. Or two, they haven't done nearly enough world building, and as a result, they're like, if I don't just dump all this information about the character on you, you won't know it. Well, that's not a good thing. You should have built the world out fully enough that when I see the character interacting with the world, I'm able to say, oh, this is the feeling I get from that character. This is the feeling I get from what they're doing. It's able to show me how they feel about things based on their interactions. Those feelings are very distinct too. They are able to be shown in a way that is much more obvious. And that's only if you've properly developed your world. So that way people can interact with it in a fully fleshed out manner. That being said, make sure that you don't neglect your characters either. The world is supposed to be built to help increase showing of how your characters work. If your world is not fully built, you cannot fully show your character to the best of their potential. However, if your character's not fully built, you still can't show them to the best of your potential. That being said, I would love to talk more about showing characters at some point. If you guys are interested in talking about how to properly build and how to fully build a 3D character, in my opinion and my opinion as an editor on what I have seen work and what I haven't seen work in building a good 3D character, please let me know in the comments below. If you have any questions about fantasy world building or any other things that you would love to see about how to show and not tell with fantasy world building better, one of the major things I would say is just make sure you use the 5 senses to help build your world. You don't have to say there were cinnamon rolls baking. You can say the scent of cinnamon rolls wafted across the street. That tells you everything you need to know. You now know there are cinnamon rolls without having to say that there are cinnamon rolls in a deliberate fashion. You don't have to tell me, you can show me through 5 senses. And ultimately, I think that's the best way to help your character interact with this fully fleshed out world you've created. If you have any questions, please comment below. I know today's lesson was particularly short, but that's because I'm doing it right before we're getting things started for the rest of Dungeons & Dragons for Teens. So thank you so much. Have a great day.